The orphaned boy plays the violin to earn money with a fierce passion for the instrument. However, he then embarks on a journey that changes his life. What story unfolds and what secrets will be uncovered? Let's listen closely. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The orphanage on the outskirts of Chicago was a solemn, imposing building made of worn-out bricks and surrounded by a rusty iron fence. It had an air of quiet discipline, as if its walls held secrets too heavy to reveal. The strict routines kept the place running like clockwork, and while there were moments of warmth between the caretakers and children, they were rare and often fleeting. Inside this building lived James, an 8-year-old boy with a protective gaze and a heavy heart, and his 6-year-old sister Sophie, whose delicate figure and wide eyes gave her an air of fragility. The two were inseparable, their bond strengthened by the shared sorrow of a past they barely remembered. James would often sit by the large window in their shared room, gazing out at the world beyond the iron fence, as if hoping it might hold the answers he was searching for. He had faint, fragmented memories of a grand, luxurious house, though the details eluded him. Sometimes he saw flashes of beautiful paintings on the walls, or a glistening white piano in a room bathed in sunlight. It was hard to tell if these memories were real or just fragments of a dream, but James clung to them, for they were the only connection he had to a past he could no longer touch. What he clung to most of all, however, was the small black violin case he always carried. It was worn and plain, but James treated it with the utmost care. He held it close, as if it held within it a piece of himself that could easily be lost. No one at the orphanage knew where it had come from. Not even James had a clear answer. But he knew that this violin was his, and when he played it, he felt a strange comfort, as though the music could shield him from the harsh realities of his life. Sophie would listen as he played, her face lit with admiration. She adored her brother, relying on him for comfort and protection in the sometimes cold and unforgiving environment of the orphanage. Their lives were defined by the routines and rules of the place, but when James played his violin, time seemed to stop for both of them. Among the other children, James and Sophie stood out, not only because of their quietness, but also because of their unwavering loyalty to one another. While the other kids spent their time playing in groups or causing mischief, James and Sophie were often on their own. Sophie had a few friends, including Lily, a shy and gentle girl who had arrived at the orphanage just a few months earlier. Lily quickly became Sophie's confidant, and the two girls would spend hours together whispering and giggling, providing each other with much-needed companionship. The caretakers, too, had grown fond of the siblings, especially Laura, a warm-hearted woman in her late 30s with kind, understanding eyes. She was different from the other caretakers, who were often too busy to give the children individual attention. Laura seemed to carry her own quiet sadness, and James often wondered if she, too, had lost someone close. She had a special way of connecting with James and Sophie, offering small gestures of comfort, a soft pat on the shoulder, a gentle smile, that made the orphanage feel a bit less daunting. One evening, as James sat by the window, he whispered to Sophie, "Do you think we'll ever leave this place?" Sophie looked up at him, her eyes full of a mixture of hope and doubt. "I don't know, James. Maybe someone will come for us, someone who remembers us." James nodded, though deep down he knew the chances were slim. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, beyond the walls of the orphanage, there was a place they belonged, a place where they were wanted. The days passed in the usual rhythm of meals, chores, and whispered conversations. Occasionally, the other children would make fun of James for always carrying his violin case, mocking him for his fancy instrument. But James ignored their taunts, holding the case tighter as if their words couldn't touch him. He had long learned that the violin was his only friend in this place, aside from Sophie, and no one else understood what it meant to him. Laura often watched James with a curious look, sensing there was more to the boy than he let on. One evening, after hearing him play a hauntingly beautiful melody, she approached him and asked, "James, where did you learn to play like that?" James shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I don't remember," he replied softly, which was the truth. He couldn't recall who had taught him, or why the melodies felt so familiar, as if they had been etched into his soul. Laura gave him a gentle smile, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "Well, it's a gift, James. Don't ever lose it." James nodded, gripping the violin case as if it were a lifeline. Though he couldn't remember his past, he felt as though his music held the key to it. And as he played, he could almost feel the presence of someone he had loved, someone who was now just a distant memory. The orphanage was filled with children, each with their own stories, each carrying their own sorrows and dreams. But there was something about James and Sophie that set them apart, something that made Laura believe their story was far from over. She watched them with a sense of protectiveness, as though she were guarding two fragile flames in the midst of a storm, hoping they wouldn't be snuffed out too soon. James's memories came in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a dark room. Sometimes, as he lay in bed with his eyes closed, flashes of another life would appear, fleeting, haunting images of places he'd never seen, but somehow felt were his own. There was always the grand, sprawling house, with walls adorned in artwork and a piano, large and gleaming, sitting like a silent sentinel in a sunlit room. He didn't know why these images came to him, or why they filled him with a strange sense of both warmth and sadness. One chilly autumn afternoon, James sat alone in the orphanage's small library, leafing through an old book, though he wasn't really reading. Sophie was playing outside with Lily, and the faint sounds of their laughter drifted through the window. James tried to focus on the words in front of him, but his mind wandered back to that house, to those faint memories that lingered on the edges of his mind. "What are you thinking about, James?" came a gentle voice. Startled, James looked up to see Laura standing by the door. She had been watching him, her eyes soft and understanding. Over the past few months, Laura had become a constant source of comfort for James, someone who seemed to see beyond the quiet facade he wore. She didn't press him with questions, but somehow he felt she understood more than she let on. James hesitated, unsure if he should share his thoughts, but something in Laura's gaze made him feel safe, as though he could tell her anything. "Sometimes I see things. A big house with paintings and a white piano," James said quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of the book. "I don't know why I remember it, but it feels familiar." Laura tilted her head thoughtfully, a slight smile playing on her lips. "A big house, you say? That sounds like something from a fairy tale." James's cheeks reddened. He was used to the other children laughing at his memories, brushing them off as dreams. But Laura's voice held no trace of mockery, only curiosity. "It's not just a dream," he insisted, a touch of frustration in his voice. "I know it's real, or at least it was." Laura nodded, as though considering his words carefully. She didn't dismiss his memories, but instead looked at him with a quiet empathy. "Sometimes, James, our minds hold on to things that feel real, even if we don't fully understand them. Maybe those memories are your mind's way of holding on to something important." James glanced down, uncertain if that explanation satisfied him. "I don't remember my parents either," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But sometimes I feel like they're still close, just out of reach." Laura's expression softened. "Our minds have a way of keeping those we love close to us, even when they are not here." She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her warmth grounding him. "Maybe that house, that piano, maybe it's a part of you that you carry with you, no matter where you are." James looked up, meeting her kind gaze. He felt a pang of longing, wishing he could remember more, wishing he could explain the feelings he couldn't put into words. But Laura's words stayed with him, settling into his heart like a quiet reassurance. Later that evening, after the other children had gone to bed, James sat by the window, gazing at the dark sky. He wondered if, somewhere out there, his parents were looking at the same stars, thinking of him and Sophie. The weight of the unknown pressed down on him, but he clung to Laura's words, letting them bring him a small measure of comfort. Over the next few weeks, James's memories grew sharper, and his longing to understand them deepened. He would sometimes try to talk to Sophie about the house and the piano, but she didn't remember the same things he did. Her memories were even more fragmented, as if time had softened their edges. Sophie's world was filled with the immediate joys and sorrows of the orphanage, of her friendship with Lily, and of the stories James told her at night. She didn't seem to carry the same ache for the past that James did. But Laura noticed. She would sometimes find James staring off into the distance, lost in thought, his violin case resting beside him like a silent companion. Once, she had caught him running his fingers over the case as though it held a secret he was desperate to unlock. "James," she said one afternoon, as they sat alone in the quiet of the dining room, "have you ever thought about who taught you to play the violin?" James looked down at the instrument, his brow furrowed. "No, I just know that I can. When I play, it feels like I'm home." Laura's heart tightened at his words. She had seen many children come and go from the orphanage, each with their own sorrows and dreams. But there was something about James, a depth to his silence, a determination in his gaze, that made her believe he was meant for something beyond the walls of the orphanage. She smiled softly. "Maybe one day, James, you'll find the answers you're looking for. Until then, don't lose faith in what you know to be true." Her words lingered in his mind as he went to bed that night, his thoughts swirling with images of the house, the piano, and the faint echoes of a melody he couldn't quite place. As James drifted into sleep, he dreamed of the house again. But this time, it felt more vivid. He saw himself standing in a room filled with light, his hands resting on the keys of a grand piano. A woman with kind eyes and a soft smile stood beside him, guiding his hands as they moved across the keys. The melody was unfamiliar, yet comforting, as though it belonged to him in some unspoken way. He awoke with a start, the memory still fresh, but as he sat up, it began to fade, slipping from his grasp like water through his fingers. Frustrated, he clutched his violin case, hoping it would bring the memories back. But they were gone, leaving only the lingering warmth of the woman's smile and the soft echo of the melody. The following day, Laura found him in the library again, his gaze distant. She knew he was haunted by memories he couldn't fully remember, and though she didn't understand why, she felt a deep empathy for him. "You know, James," she said gently, "sometimes the answers come when we least expect them. Just keep playing your music, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find your way back to where you belong." James nodded, a quiet determination settling over him. He didn't know how or when, but he felt a growing certainty that his music was the key to uncovering his past. And with Laura's words echoing in his heart, he resolved to keep playing, hoping that one day the notes would lead him back to the memories he yearned to understand. Life at the orphanage settled into a steady rhythm, each day blending into the next with a mix of chores, meals, and quiet moments of play. For James and Sophie, the orphanage was all they had known for as long as they could remember. While Sophie found small pockets of joy in her friendship with Lily, James kept to himself, his violin case always close by, his thoughts often drifting to the fragments of his past that lingered like unfinished songs. The dining hall was where most of the children gathered, their laughter and chatter echoing off the old walls. James would often sit at the end of a long table, with Sophie by his side, quietly eating as he watched the other children interact. There was a group of older boys who sometimes teased him, calling him Violin Boy or Fancy Hands, as they mocked the way he held his instrument with such care. James tried to ignore them, focusing instead on Sophie, who would smile up at him, her wide eyes full of admiration. Sophie's friend Lily, a soft-spoken girl with a shy smile, would often join them at the table. She was about the same age as Sophie, and had a gentle presence that seemed to calm Sophie's own quiet anxieties. The two girls would sit together, whispering secrets and giggling, their friendship a small but vital comfort in the orphanage's sometimes cold environment. Despite the companionship of Lily and the kindness of Laura, James and Sophie often felt isolated. It wasn't that the other children didn't like them. Most simply didn't understand them. James's quiet nature and his attachment to the violin made him different, and in a place where conformity was encouraged, different often led to exclusion. Every day had its routine, from morning chores to afternoon lessons. The children would file into the small classroom where Miss Hampton, an older caretaker with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, would teach them the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. While Sophie loved to learn, and often raised her hand eagerly, James found himself struggling to focus. His mind would drift, the hum of Miss Hampton's voice fading as he thought about the house, the piano, and the woman who sometimes appeared in his dreams. When lessons were over, the children had an hour of free time before dinner. This was when James would take out his violin, finding a quiet corner in the garden or the library where he could play without interruption. The familiar notes would fill the air, soft and haunting, as if he were trying to communicate something he couldn't put into words. One evening, as he played, he noticed Laura standing nearby, listening with a look of gentle admiration. She didn't say anything, but her presence felt comforting, as though she understood the depth of his music in a way no one else could. James finished his piece and looked up, meeting her gaze. "That was beautiful, James," she said softly. "Your music, it has a way of speaking to the heart." James looked down, feeling a mix of pride and embarrassment. "Thank you, Laura," he replied quietly, unsure of what else to say. Laura smiled, her eyes filled with a warmth that made him feel less alone. "Never stop playing, James. Your music is a gift, and it's something that no one can ever take from you." While James found solace in his music, Sophie's world was centered on her friendship with Lily. The two girls would spend hours together, sharing stories and dreaming of the day they might leave the orphanage. Sophie often confided in Lily about her desire to find a family, to have a home where she could feel safe and loved. Lily, who had arrived at the orphanage under circumstances just as mysterious as Sophie's, shared these dreams, and together they created a bond that was as strong as family. One afternoon, as they sat by the small, dusty window in the girls' dormitory, Lily turned to Sophie, her face thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever leave this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie hesitated, glancing out the window at the leafless trees swaying in the wind. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I hope so. Maybe someone out there is looking for us." Lily nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "I like to think that my parents are still out there, somewhere," she murmured. "That they just lost me somehow." Sophie squeezed her friend's hand, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Maybe one day we'll find them. Or maybe they'll find us." The two girls sat in silence, their thoughts lingering on the families they longed for, the families they could barely remember. As the weeks passed, James and Sophie continued to navigate the routines of orphanage life, drawing strength from each other and from the small moments of connection they found with others. But despite their efforts to blend in, there were times when they couldn't escape the cruelty of the other children. One gray afternoon, as James was practicing his violin in the corner of the garden, a group of older boys approached, smirking as they watched him play. James tried to ignore them, focusing on the music, but their mocking voices grew louder. "Hey, violin boy," one of them sneered. "Who do you think you are? Some kind of fancy musician?" Another boy snickered, mimicking the way James held his bow. "Yeah, maybe he thinks he's too good for the rest of us." James clenched his jaw, refusing to look up. He knew that if he reacted, it would only make things worse. But just as he was about to continue playing, one of the boys reached out and grabbed his violin case, yanking it from his hands. "Hey!" James cried, his heart pounding with panic. "Give that back!" The boy held the case out of reach, a cruel smile on his face. "Why don't you come and take it, violin boy?" Before James could respond, Sophie appeared, her face filled with anger and determination. "Leave him alone!" she shouted, stepping between James and the boys. Her small figure trembled, but she stood her ground, her eyes blazing. The boys hesitated, taken aback by her defiance. After a moment, they exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed. With a dismissive shrug, they tossed the violin case to the ground and walked away, laughing as they disappeared around the corner. James knelt down, picking up the case and inspecting it for any damage. Relief washed over him as he found it unharmed, but he couldn't shake the lingering humiliation and frustration. "Thank you, Sophie," he said softly, his voice barely audible. Sophie smiled, her eyes warm with the fierce protectiveness she felt for her brother. "They're just jealous," she said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "They don't understand how special you are." James managed a small smile, though a part of him couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. Even among his peers, he was an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit. But as he looked at Sophie, he felt a surge of gratitude for her unwavering loyalty. She was his anchor, the one constant in a world that often felt confusing and uncertain. And as long as he had her by his side, He knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Sophie whispered to James, her voice soft and filled with conviction. "One day, we're going to leave this place, James. We're going to find a home where we belong." James nodded, feeling a spark of hope ignite within him. He didn't know how or when, but he believed her words. Together they would find a way to escape the walls of the orphanage and the cruelty of those who couldn't see past their differences. And in the quiet darkness of their shared room, James clutched his violin case, letting the music of his memories fill his heart with the promise of something greater. As winter settled over Chicago, the orphanage's halls grew colder, and the days seemed to stretch longer. The gray skies and bare trees outside mirrored the mood within the walls of the orphanage. For James and Sophie, it felt like the world around them was closing in. Their longing for a place to belong, a place beyond the orphanage's walls, grew stronger with each passing day. But for Sophie, the days took a difficult turn. She began to tire more easily, her cheeks losing their usual color, and she coughed more often. James watched, his heart sinking, as his lively little sister grew weaker. She tried to reassure him, putting on a brave face and saying it was just the cold weather. But each day, her condition worsened. Laura noticed too. One morning, as Sophie sat in the dining hall, her small frame bundled in a heavy sweater, Laura knelt down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her forehead. Sophie's skin was warm, flushed with fever, and Laura's expression turned serious. "Sophie, sweetheart," she said softly, "I think we need to get you some rest." James felt a pang of worry as he watched Laura lead Sophie back to their room. He followed close behind, his eyes never leaving his sister's frail form. Laura helped Sophie settle into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin and brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'll bring you some tea," Laura promised, her voice gentle. She turned to James, her gaze filled with concern. "She needs rest, James. Let her sleep, and I'll check on her regularly." James nodded, but his worry deepened. As the days passed, Sophie's condition continued to decline. Her cough grew harsher, and she could barely eat, her once bright eyes now dull and heavy with fatigue. James felt helpless, sitting by her bed, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep. The thought of losing her was unbearable, and he could feel the weight of that fear pressing down on him, suffocating him. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Laura found James sitting alone in the dimly lit hallway, his violin case resting beside him. "James," she began softly, taking a seat next to him, "I know how worried you are about Sophie. We're doing our best to help her, but, well, the orphanage has limited resources." James looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. "She's all I have, Laura. I can't lose her." Laura placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know, James, and I think there might be something you can do." James looked at her, a glimmer of hope sparking in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Laura hesitated as though carefully choosing her words. "You're talented, James. The way you play the violin, it's something special. I think people would pay to hear you play. If you're willing, maybe you could perform and earn a little money to help cover Sophie's treatment." James stared at her, the idea slowly sinking in. He had always played his violin for himself, for Sophie, to bring comfort to their lonely lives. But the thought of using his music to help Sophie filled him with a new sense of purpose. "Do you think it would work?" he asked, his voice laced with both hope and uncertainty. Laura nodded, her expression encouraging. "We can try, James. I'll talk to the director, and if she agrees, we'll make arrangements. But I'll be with you every step of the way. You won't have to do this alone." James took a deep breath, his hands gripping the violin case tightly. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he had to try. For Sophie, he would face any challenge. The following morning, Laura spoke with the orphanage director, explaining James's plan. The director, a stern woman with a practical mind, listened carefully. At first, she seemed hesitant, questioning the feasibility and the risks. But Laura's calm persistence and her assurance that she would personally oversee everything eventually won her over. "All right," the director finally said, eyeing Laura and James with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "But understand this, Laura, you're responsible for him. If anything goes wrong, I understand, Laura replied firmly. She glanced at James, offering him an encouraging smile. Thank you. We won't let you down. With the director's reluctant approval, Laura and James made plans for the performance. Early the next Saturday morning, Laura helped James prepare, dressing him in a clean white shirt and his best pair of dark trousers. His violin case was polished and ready, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. Are you ready? Laura asked, adjusting her hat as they stood at the orphanage entrance. James nodded, clutching his violin case tightly. I think so. They left the orphanage and made their way to a nearby street market, where people from the neighborhood gathered to buy fresh produce and browse stalls of handmade crafts. The hum of chatter and the lively energy filled the air, making James's heart race with anticipation and a touch of fear. Laura led him to a small open square near the market entrance, where he would perform. She placed a small empty hat on the ground, then turned to James, her smile reassuring. Whenever you're ready, James. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he opened the violin case and lifted the instrument. The familiar weight of it in his hands calmed him, grounding him in a way nothing else could. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the market fade as he centered himself. And then he began to play. The first notes trembled in the air, soft and hesitant, like whispers testing the space around them. James's fingers pressed carefully on the strings, his grip cautious as he coaxed the melody out of the violin. The bow glided across the strings, and with each passing note, his confidence began to grow. The music flowed with a new clarity, filling the square with a haunting beauty that seemed to cut through the hustle and bustle of the marketplace. At first, the people passing by barely noticed him, focused on their morning routines, their arms loaded with bags and baskets. But as the melody grew, swelling with warmth and sorrow, heads began to turn. The mournful, almost aching sound of the violin seemed to pull them in, touching a part of them that the busy day had almost hidden away. Some people slowed their steps, their faces softening as they listened. They looked at James, but it was as if they were seeing something beyond him, something carried in the notes themselves, a memory, a longing, a distant warmth. James, lost in his music, felt as if he were standing in a different place altogether. He was no longer in the middle of a crowded market, but back in that familiar room of his memories, surrounded by the faint scent of wood polish and the soft glow of sunlight filtering through tall windows. The haunting melody poured from him, each note bearing the weight of his love, his worries, and his fierce determination to help Sophie. For those precious moments, the violin was his voice, speaking the things he could not say aloud. As he played, Laura moved quietly through the crowd, her hat outstretched. People began to drop coins and bills into it, their faces filled with admiration, their eyes lingering on the boy who seemed to be pouring his soul into the music. A mother held her child close, watching with a tender smile. An elderly man, his face creased with years of hardship, closed his eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm. A young couple paused, their hands clasped, sharing a look of quiet understanding. Each person felt the pull of the music, as if it held a message just for them. James was oblivious to the crowd, to the gathering coins, to the whispered words of appreciation. In that moment, his only thought was Sophie. Each note he played was for her, a promise, a plea. The music swelled, deepening into a soft but powerful crescendo, and he felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He was playing not just to help her, but because he needed her to know how much he cared, how desperately he would fight for her. The piece ended, and for a moment there was only silence, the notes lingering in the air like a gentle mist. Then came a wave of applause, soft but sincere, a testament to the way his music had touched the crowd. James blinked, surprised to see the small audience that had gathered, their faces lit with a mixture of awe and admiration. He offered them a shy, grateful smile, a blush coloring his cheeks. Emboldened, he lifted the violin once more, launching into a new melody, a softer, gentler piece that felt like a lullaby, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. This time, he played with ease, letting the music flow from him as naturally as breathing. His nerves faded, replaced by a calm, steady resolve. This was his gift, his way of reaching out to the world. And as he played, he felt a quiet pride, knowing that he was doing something that mattered, that could make a difference. When he finally lowered his violin, a sense of peace settled over him. He didn't know how much money they'd gathered, but he felt that it was enough, that he had done enough, for now. Laura stepped forward, her eyes bright with pride and a touch of emotion. "You did wonderfully, James," she whispered, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. An hour passed, and the hat in Laura's hands grew heavier with coins and bills. James played until his fingers began to ache, stopping only when Laura gently touched his shoulder. "You've done enough, James," she said softly, her eyes shining with pride. "You've done more than enough." They gathered the money and left the square, with James feeling a strange mixture of relief and exhilaration. He had played not just for himself, but for Sophie, and the thought filled him with a quiet pride. When they returned to the orphanage, James immediately went to Sophie's bedside, taking her hand and giving it a gentle squeeze. She smiled weakly up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You did that? For me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded, his eyes warm with affection. "Anything for you, Sophie." Laura counted the money they had collected, her expression thoughtful. "This will help, James. It might not be enough to cover everything, but it's a good start." James felt a surge of hope. He didn't know how many more performances he would need to give, but he was willing to do whatever it took. For Sophie, he would play until his fingers bled. And as he sat by her bed that evening, holding her hand and humming the melody he had played that morning, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things would get better. James continued performing each weekend at the market, and every time a crowd would gather, drawn to the young boy with the violin who played as if his heart depended on it. He grew more comfortable with each performance, his fingers finding their way across the strings with increasing confidence. The money he earned wasn't enough for all of Sophie's medical needs, but it was helping, giving them a glimmer of hope. On one crisp Saturday morning, James took his usual place at the edge of the bustling market square. The autumn air was cool, and the smell of freshly baked bread and spices filled the air. Laura stood nearby, collecting donations as James began his first piece. He closed his eyes, letting the music carry him away, focusing on Sophie's smiling face as he played, each note a prayer for her health. As he played, he noticed a man standing in the crowd. The man was tall and well-dressed, with salt and pepper hair and a serious, contemplative expression. There was something about him, an air of quiet dignity and purpose. He stood still, hands tucked into his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on James, with an intensity that was both unsettling and strangely familiar. James tried to ignore the man, focusing instead on his music. But he felt the man's eyes on him, watching every movement, every note. When he finished the piece, the crowd applauded, and James managed a shy smile, bowing slightly before beginning his next song. As he played, he noticed the man stepping closer, moving through the crowd, until he stood at the very edge of James's performance space. The man waited patiently as James finished his second piece. When James lowered his violin, the man stepped forward, his voice soft but commanding. "You play beautifully," he said, his words carrying a warmth that surprised James. James looked up, meeting the man's gaze. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The man studied him, his gray eyes filled with something James couldn't quite identify. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. James hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I don't know," he admitted, glancing down at his violin. "I just know how." The man's expression softened, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Do you know who wrote the piece you just played?" James shook his head. "No, sir. It feels familiar, like something I've known for a long time." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep thought. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a crisp, folded bill, which he placed carefully in Laura's collection hat. Laura thanked him, but his attention remained on James. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said softly, as if speaking more to himself than to James. Before James could respond, Laura stepped forward, her protective instincts kicking in. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely, but with a hint of firmness. "James is here with me, and we appreciate your generosity. He's a very special young man." The man turned his gaze to Laura, offering a respectful nod. "Of course. I didn't mean to intrude. He looked back at James, his expression one of quiet understanding. I apologize if I startled you. I just felt a connection. It's not every day you hear such talent. James managed a small smile, unsure of what to make of the man's words. The man lingered for a moment longer, as though contemplating whether to say more, but then he simply nodded, turning to leave. As he walked away, James couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen this man before, though he couldn't remember where or when. Laura placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. You did wonderfully today, James, and don't worry about that man. Sometimes people just see something special and don't know how to express it. James nodded, but his mind remained on the man with the gray eyes. There had been something almost familiar about him, something that tugged at memories buried deep within his mind. He couldn't explain it. The card with Charles Anderson's name and address weighed heavily in James's pocket, like a small but persistent reminder of a door waiting to be opened. For days, he turned it over in his mind, trying to decide if he should go to Charles's school. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. He had spent his entire life within the walls of the orphanage, and the idea of stepping into a world where music wasn't just a comfort but a purpose was almost too much to believe. Laura noticed his hesitation. She could see the way he would take the card out, glance at it, then tuck it back into his pocket. One afternoon, as they sat together in the orphanage's quiet garden, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. James, she began softly, if you feel drawn to Mr. Anderson's school, it's okay to be curious. Sometimes, taking a step into the unknown is the only way to find what you're looking for. James looked up at her, his eyes filled with both hope and uncertainty. Do you think he knows something about me? Laura's gaze softened, and she nodded. I think he might. And maybe it's worth finding out. After a moment's silence, James made up his mind. He would go to Charles Anderson's school, if only to find out why this man seemed so familiar, why his eyes held a look of recognition that James couldn't understand. The following weekend, Laura accompanied James to Charles's music school, a grand old building nestled in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The entrance was framed by ivy-covered walls, and as they approached, James felt his heart pound with anticipation. He held onto his violin case tightly, taking comfort in its familiar weight. Charles greeted them at the door, his expression warm and welcoming. James, he said, extending his hand, I'm glad you came. James shook his hand, feeling the man's steady grip, and nodded. Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Anderson. Please, call me Charles, he replied, smiling. He gestured for them to follow him inside, where the halls were filled with the soft sounds of distant piano music and the occasional laughter of students. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of past students and famous musicians, each telling a story of its own. As they walked, Charles spoke with a quiet reverence. This school was built on a love for music. I've dedicated my life to helping young musicians find their path, their voice. He glanced at James, his expression serious. And I believe you have a unique voice, James, one that deserves to be heard. They reached a large, airy room where a grand piano sat in the center, its surface polished to a mirror-like shine. Several students were gathered in the room, practicing different pieces, their expressions focused and intent. Charles guided James to a seat by the piano and sat down beside him, nodding for him to take out his violin. Would you mind playing something for us? He asked, his voice gentle. James took a deep breath, lifting his violin and positioning it beneath his chin. He closed his eyes, letting the familiar comfort of the instrument calm his nerves. Then he began to play, allowing the music to flow through him, each note resonating with emotion. It was a melody he had played many times, but in this room, surrounded by other musicians and under Charles's attentive gaze, it felt different, more powerful, more real. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, followed by a soft murmur of admiration from the students. Charles's face held a look of deep thought, as though he had just witnessed something important, something he had been waiting for. You play with such emotion, James, he said quietly. It's rare to find someone so young with such a natural connection to music. James blushed, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to receiving praise, and a part of him struggled to believe he deserved it. After a moment, Charles turned to Laura, his expression serious. "I want to help him grow, to give him the tools and the guidance he needs. But more than that, I want to offer him something he may not have had before, a home." Laura's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced at James, who looked back at her, his face a mixture of surprise and hope. "Are you saying—" Laura began, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles nodded. "I would like to adopt James and his sister, Sophie. I believe they belong here, and I want to provide them with a family, with a place where they can be loved and supported." James felt his heart race, a flood of emotions washing over him. The idea of being adopted, of leaving the orphanage and starting a new life, was both thrilling and overwhelming. He glanced at Laura, who smiled at him, her eyes filled with tears of happiness. "James," she said softly, "this is the chance you've been waiting for. A home, a real home." James looked at Charles, his gaze filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir." "Charles, I don't know what to say." Charles reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, James. Just know that from this moment on, you and Sophie will never have to face the world alone." Within a week, the arrangements were made, and James and Sophie were officially adopted by Charles Anderson. On the day they left the orphanage, Laura hugged them both tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so proud of you, James," she whispered. "You've been so strong, and now you're finally getting the life you deserve." James hugged her back, his own eyes misty. "Thank you, Laura, for everything." As they drove away, Sophie clung to James's hand, her face pressed against the window as she watched the orphanage disappear in the distance. Charles sat in the front seat, glancing back at them with a warm smile. When they arrived at Charles's home, a spacious, elegant mansion filled with light and warmth, James and Sophie were introduced to Rebecca, the housekeeper. She was a tall, stern-looking woman, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Welcome, James and Sophie," she said, her voice brisk but friendly. "I'll be looking after you both, and I expect you to follow the house rules. But don't worry, we'll make sure you feel right at home." James nodded, a little intimidated but reassured by the kindness in her gaze. He could tell that, beneath her stern exterior, Rebecca cared deeply for those in her charge. Charles gave them a tour of the house, showing them their new rooms, which were spacious and filled with beautiful furnishings. James's room overlooked the garden, with a small desk and a music stand beside the window. Sophie's room was next door, decorated with soft pastel colors and a cozy reading nook where she could curl up with her favorite books. As James unpacked his few belongings, he felt a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. This place was like a dream, so different from the orphanage, so filled with warmth and beauty. And yet, a part of him still felt uncertain, as though he didn't quite belong. That evening, they gathered for dinner in the grand dining room, where Charles and Rebecca joined them. The meal was delicious, far beyond anything they had ever tasted at the orphanage. Sophie's eyes lit up as she tasted the food, and for the first time in weeks, she looked healthy and happy. After dinner, Charles invited James to play his violin, and he agreed, feeling a sense of pride and gratitude as he performed for his new family. The music filled the room, weaving a bond between them, a promise of new beginnings and shared dreams. When he finished, Charles applauded, his eyes filled with admiration. "James, I'm so glad you're here. You and Sophie have brought a new light to this house." James looked at him, his heart swelling with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Charles nodded, a soft smile on his face. "This is just the beginning, James. There's so much more to come." And as James and Sophie settled into their new home that night, they felt, for the first time, a sense of peace, a feeling that they had finally found the place where they truly belonged. Settling into their new life with Charles was a mixture of excitement and adjustment for James and Sophie. Charles's house was a beautiful, sprawling mansion surrounded by lush gardens, a place filled with light and the warmth of possibility. Yet, as much as they enjoyed their new surroundings, both siblings felt a bit like strangers stepping into someone else's life. The weight of their past, the memories of the orphanage, still lingered, making the transition feel both wonderful and strange. One of the biggest surprises of their new life came in the form of Charles's daughter, Emily. She was close in age to James, a girl with delicate features, straight chestnut hair that framed her face, and a pair of striking gray eyes that seemed to hide as much as they revealed. Emily had grown up in a world of privilege, but her life had not been without hardship. Her mother had passed away when she was very young, leaving a void that even her father's love couldn't entirely fill. James and Sophie first met Emily one quiet afternoon in the drawing room where she was practicing on the grand piano. The notes drifted through the hall, soft and melancholic, filling the house with a haunting beauty. Drawn by the music, James and Sophie quietly stepped into the room, captivated by the sound. Emily noticed them, but didn't stop playing. Instead, she continued, her eyes focused on the keys, her expression distant. When she finally finished, there was a moment of silence before she turned to face them, her gaze cool and guarded. "Hello," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James stepped forward, his violin case in hand. "That was beautiful," he said earnestly. "You play with so much feeling." Emily offered a small, reluctant smile. "Thank you. I've been playing since I was little. My mother taught me." Sophie, who had been watching with wide eyes, spoke up, her voice filled with admiration. "It sounds like magic." Emily's expression softened, and for a moment a flicker of warmth crossed her face. But just as quickly, her gaze turned distant again, and she looked down, her fingers resting on the piano keys. Charles entered the room then, his face lighting up as he saw the three of them together. "Ah, I see you've met Emily," he said with a smile. "I was hoping you'd all get along. Music runs in the family, after all." He glanced between James and Emily, his eyes filled with a hopeful gleam. "I have an idea," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "There's a talent competition coming up in the spring. I think you two should perform together, a duet, piano, and violin." Emily stiffened, glancing at James with a look of uncertainty. James felt his own heart race, the thought of performing with Emily both thrilling and intimidating. He looked at her, trying to gauge her reaction, but her expression remained closed off, her eyes a storm of conflicting emotions. Charles sensed their hesitation and placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "It could be a wonderful opportunity," he said softly, his voice filled with encouragement. "The two of you could create something truly special." Emily's gaze flickered between her father and James, and after a moment she nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. "Okay," she said quietly. I'll try." Over the next few weeks, James and Emily began practicing together under Charles's guidance. Their sessions were intense and sometimes awkward, each of them navigating the unfamiliar territory of collaboration. Emily was reserved, her movements precise and controlled, while James played with raw emotion, allowing the music to guide him without overthinking. At times, their differences felt like a barrier, an invisible wall that neither could fully breach. Sophie watched their practices from the sidelines, her eyes filled with admiration and curiosity. She cheered them on, offering words of encouragement, and occasionally breaking the tension with her bright, innocent laughter. Her presence became a comfort, a reminder of the love and support they had, even when the music felt like a battle of wills. One afternoon, as they practiced a particularly challenging piece, Emily made a mistake, hitting a wrong note that jarred the melody. She froze, her face flushing with embarrassment as she quickly moved her fingers to correct it. But the moment had already passed, and the tension in the room was palpable. "Let's try it again," James suggested gently, sensing her frustration. Emily shook her head, her face tight with annoyance. "No, it's fine. I don't need your help." James felt a pang of hurt but remained calm. "We're in this together, Emily. It's okay to make mistakes." Emily's eyes flashed with irritation. "You don't understand. I can't afford to make mistakes." Charles, who had been observing from the back of the room, stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Emily," he said softly, "music isn't about perfection. It's about expression, about sharing a part of yourself. Don't be so hard on yourself." Emily looked away, her jaw clenched, and after a moment she nodded reluctantly. But James could see the struggle in her eyes, the pressure she felt to live up to her father's expectations. He wondered if her reluctance was less about him and more about her own fears. After that practice, James found Emily sitting alone by the garden pond, her gaze distant as she watched the water ripple in the afternoon breeze. Gathering his courage, he approached her, sitting down beside her in silence. "Emily," he began, his voice gentle, "I know this isn't easy, but I want us to be friends. Not just for the music, but because we're family now." Emily didn't respond at first, her gaze fixed on the water. But after a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard," she admitted. "I've been alone for so long. It's hard to let people in." James felt a pang of empathy, recognizing a part of himself in her words. "I understand," he said quietly. "I felt the same way when we came here. But maybe we can help each other." Emily looked at him, her eyes softening for the first time. She gave a small nod, and though she didn't say anything more, James felt a sense of connection forming between them, a fragile but hopeful bond. Their practices improved after that, each of them finding a rhythm that felt natural and balanced. Emily began to open up, sharing stories of her mother, who had loved music just as much as she did. She told James about her childhood, the days when she and her mother would play duets on the piano, filling the house with laughter and song. In return, James shared stories from the orphanage, the way he and Sophie had created their own small world within its walls, relying on each other to get through the difficult days. He told her about Laura, about the quiet moments by the window, about the music that had been his only comfort. Slowly, the invisible wall between them began to fade, replaced by a mutual respect and understanding. They learned to anticipate each other's movements, to listen and adapt, creating a harmony that felt effortless and real. Charles watched their progress with pride, his eyes shining with joy as he saw his daughter and adopted son growing not just as musicians, but as family. Sophie, too, felt the change, her own happiness blossoming as she saw James and Emily growing closer. She spent her days exploring the mansion, befriending Rebecca, and helping with small chores around the house. She even made a friend in the neighborhood, a shy but cheerful girl named Sarah, who shared her love for books and adventure. For the first time in their lives, James and Sophie felt like they belonged. The mansion was no longer a place of strangers and uncertainty. It was their home, a place filled with love, music, and the promise of new beginnings. As winter melted into spring, the day of the talent competition approached, and James and Emily prepared for their performance with a mixture of excitement and nerves. On the night before the competition, Charles gathered the family in the living room, his expression filled with pride. "No matter what happens tomorrow," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I am incredibly proud of both of you. You've worked hard, not just as musicians, but as siblings. Remember, this performance is a celebration of who you are. Just be yourselves, and the music will do the rest." James and Emily exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had come so far, and now, standing on the edge of something new, they felt ready to face whatever came next. The day of the competition had arrived, and the air was charged with excitement and nerves. The hall was packed with families, friends, and young musicians who had come from all over the city to showcase their talents. James and Emily sat together backstage, the hum of chatter and faint music creating a nervous energy that vibrated through them both. Sophie, who had come along to support them, sat with Charles in the audience, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she whispered words of encouragement under her breath. Backstage, James and Emily went over their piece one last time, their fingers moving over imaginary instruments as they rehearsed silently. They exchanged a nervous smile, each feeling the weight of the moment, but also the thrill of finally sharing their music together with the world. "You ready?" James asked, giving Emily a gentle nudge. Emily took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." Their names were called, and they stood, exchanging a final look of encouragement before stepping onto the brightly lit stage. The lights were blinding at first, but as their eyes adjusted, they could see the faint outline of the audience before them. James took his place with his violin, while Emily sat at the grand piano, her fingers hovering over the keys, her gaze focused and determined. As they began to play, the first soft notes filled the hall, weaving together in a delicate dance of violin and piano. The audience fell silent, captivated by the haunting melody that spoke of love, loss, and hope. The music built layer by layer as James and Emily poured their emotions into every note, every chord. Their bond, their shared journey, was reflected in the music, each note carrying the story of two souls who had found each other amidst the loneliness and uncertainty. James closed his eyes, letting the music carry him, trusting Emily to match his rhythm. They were a perfect harmony, each instinctively knowing when to yield and when to lead, their instruments blending in a way that felt almost magical. For a moment, it was as if they were the only two people in the world, united by the music that flowed between them like a river of memories and dreams. But then, suddenly, something went wrong. Just as they were approaching the crescendo, Emily's hand slipped, hitting a wrong note that shattered the delicate harmony they had created. The sound jarred both of them, and James opened his eyes, glancing over at Emily, who looked stricken, her fingers trembling on the keys. For a heartbeat, they both froze, the music hanging awkwardly in the air. James could feel the audience's anticipation turn to tension, and he knew they couldn't leave it like this. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, he picked up the melody again, his violin singing out in a gentle, soothing tone, coaxing Emily back into the piece. Emily hesitated, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but James's steady playing gave her the courage to continue. She took a deep breath, finding her place on the keys, and together they brought the piece to a soft, graceful end, finishing with a note of quiet resilience that spoke of their determination and unity. The audience erupted into applause, and though it wasn't the thunderous ovation they had hoped for, the response was warm and heartfelt. James looked at Emily, offering her a reassuring smile, and she managed a small, shaky smile in return, though her eyes were filled with disappointment. As they walked off the stage, Emily's shoulders slumped, her face a mixture of frustration and sadness. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, barely acknowledging the other performers and staff, who offered polite smiles and nods of encouragement. "I'm sorry," she whispered as they reached the backstage area, her voice barely audible. "I ruined it." James shook his head, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "No, you didn't. We finished strong, Emily. That's what matters." But Emily didn't seem convinced. She glanced over at her father, who had come backstage with Sophie, his expression unreadable as he watched his daughter. Emily's face flushed, and she looked away, clearly expecting disappointment in his gaze. Charles approached, his face calm and kind, though his eyes held a hint of sadness. He placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, his voice soft but firm. "Emily, mistakes happen. What's important is that you kept going, that you didn't give up. I'm proud of you for that." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with surprise and relief. "But I messed up," she stammered, her voice thick with emotion. Charles smiled, shaking his head. "You didn't mess up, sweetheart. You played beautifully. Both of you did." He turned to James, his expression warm and proud. "You two created something special tonight. That's all I could ever ask for." Emily blinked back tears, her face softening as her father's words sank in. She glanced at James, who gave her an encouraging smile, and for the first time, she seemed to believe that maybe, just maybe, her father's love wasn't tied to perfection. As they left the competition hall, Sophie chattered excitedly, congratulating them on their performance, her face bright with admiration. James and Emily listened, their spirits lifted by her enthusiasm, though a lingering tension hung in the air. Emily seemed quieter than usual, her face contemplative as they drove back to the mansion. Over the next few days, something shifted within the household. Charles, while proud of both children, seemed to withdraw slightly, focusing more on James during their practice sessions. Emily's piano remained untouched, and she spent more time alone, retreating into her room or the garden, her usually bright eyes shadowed with sadness. James noticed the change, and though he tried to reach out, Emily remained distant, her answers short and polite, as though an invisible wall had gone up between them. Charles, too, seemed preoccupied, often glancing at Emily with a mixture of regret and sorrow. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, the silence was thick and uncomfortable. Sophie, sensing the tension, kept her gaze fixed on her plate, her usual chatter absent. Rebecca, the housekeeper, noticed as well, casting concerned glances at the family as she served the meal. Finally, unable to bear the silence, James turned to Charles, his voice hesitant but firm. "Mr. Anderson." "Charles," he began, "is something wrong? Emily seems different." and I don't want her to feel left out." Charles sighed, placing his fork down as he looked at James, his expression filled with both pride and sadness. "James, you and Emily both have remarkable talent, but sometimes people deal with setbacks in their own way. Emily is struggling, but it's a journey she'll have to navigate on her own." James frowned, glancing at Emily, who sat across the table, her gaze fixed on her plate, her face closed off. He knew that something deeper was troubling her, something that went beyond a simple performance mistake. Later that night, he found Emily sitting alone in the garden, her knees drawn up to her chest as she stared at the darkening sky. Gathering his courage, he approached her, sitting down beside her in silence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet night enveloping them like a shroud. Finally, Emily broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel like I'll never be good enough. No matter how hard I try, it's never enough." James felt a pang of sympathy, reaching out to place a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Emily, you don't have to be perfect. Music isn't about that. It's about feeling, about connection. And you have that. You have it more than anyone I've ever met." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and vulnerability. "It's hard," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It's hard to feel like I'm always falling short, especially with my dad, especially now that you're here." James's heart ached as he realized the depth of her struggle, the pressure she felt to live up to her father's expectations. He pulled her into a gentle hug, offering her the support she so desperately needed. "We're family now, Emily," he said softly. "And family doesn't give up on each other. We're in this together, okay?" Emily nodded, a small, fragile smile crossing her face. As James and Emily sat together in the garden, sharing their vulnerabilities, neither of them noticed the faint shadow near the doorway. Charles had come out, searching for Emily to check on her, his heart heavy with the knowledge that something had shifted between them since the competition. But as he approached, he paused, hearing the gentle murmur of James's voice comforting his daughter. "We're family now, Emily," James was saying softly. "And family doesn't give up on each other. We're in this together, okay?" Charles felt a pang of emotion as he watched his daughter relax in James's embrace, her usual guardedness slipping away as she nodded, a small smile breaking through her sadness. Charles had always wanted Emily to feel supported, but he realized, with a pang of regret, that he might have been blind to the pressures she was feeling, pressures he himself had unknowingly set upon her. Unable to hold back any longer, Charles took a deep breath and stepped into the garden. Emily and James turned, surprised to see him standing there, his expression a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Emily," he began, his voice gentle, "I didn't mean to intrude, but I heard what you two were talking about." Emily's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she looked down, as though preparing for a reprimand. But instead, Charles took a step closer, his gaze soft and full of remorse. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I didn't realize how much pressure you felt, how much you thought you had to live up to." Emily looked up, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Dad, I just didn't want to disappoint you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I felt like I'd never be enough, no matter how hard I tried." Charles's face softened, and he knelt down in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Emily, you are more than enough. I've watched you pour your heart into everything you do, especially your music. I see the way you care, the way you give so much of yourself." He squeezed her hands, his eyes filled with a deep, fatherly love. "I never meant for you to feel like you had to be perfect. I love you just the way you are, mistakes and all." A tear slipped down Emily's cheek, and she bit her lip, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that had been building inside her. "But you were so proud of James. I thought you'd rather have him as a son than me." Charles's expression turned stricken, and he shook his head firmly. "Emily, that couldn't be further from the truth. James has been a wonderful addition to our family, but you will always be my daughter, my first love and my joy. I'm proud of you both, and I'm so sorry if I ever made you feel like you had to compete for my love." Emily's face crumpled, and she threw her arms around her father, hugging him tightly as though afraid he might disappear. I just wanted you to be proud of me, she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Charles held her close, stroking her hair and murmuring softly, I am proud of you, Emily, more than you'll ever know, and I'll always be here to support you, however you need. James watched the exchange with a quiet smile, feeling his own heart swell with relief and happiness. He had always sensed that Emily's struggle went deeper than music, and seeing her finally find comfort in her father's embrace felt like a weight lifting from his own shoulders as well. After a few moments, Charles released Emily, though he kept one arm around her shoulder as he turned to James, his expression warm and grateful. And James, Charles said, his voice thick with emotion, thank you for being there for Emily, for being the brother she needed. I don't know if I would have realized what she was going through if it weren't for you. James nodded, his own eyes shining with emotion. We're family, he said simply. That's what we do, his voice steady and full of conviction. No matter where life takes us, remember this. You both have a place in my heart and in this family. Always. Emily and James nodded, their faces bright with gratitude and hope. They had found their family, a place of belonging and love, and as they walked back into the warm glow of the house together, they knew they would face the future with renewed strength and trust, united as family. The days following Emily's crisis brought a renewed sense of calm and closeness to the household. Emily seemed more at ease, her eyes brighter, and her laughter more frequent. James felt relieved to see his sister so happy. But even as life settled into a comforting rhythm, he found himself increasingly preoccupied with questions about his own past. One quiet evening, after the family had finished dinner and Sophie had gone off to bed, James lingered in the living room. Charles was reading by the fire, a soft smile on his face as he glanced occasionally at Emily, who was practicing a new piece on the piano. James took a deep breath, gathering his courage, and approached Charles. Mr. Anderson. Charles, he began, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. There's something I've been wanting to ask you. Charles looked up, his expression curious. Of course, James. What's on your mind? James hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor for a moment before he met Charles's eyes. I want to know more about my past, about my parents. I feel like there's something important, something I need to understand. Charles's face softened, and he placed his book down, his gaze thoughtful. I thought this day might come, he said gently. There are things about your parents that I've kept from you, not out of secrecy, but because I wanted to protect you until you were ready. James felt a surge of anticipation and fear. He had always wondered, always felt a pull toward memories that were too distant to grasp. Now, he was on the brink of finally understanding who he was, where he had come from. Charles gestured for him to sit, and James took a seat across from him, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. Emily, who had heard the conversation, stopped playing and joined them, her gaze filled with quiet support for her brother. Charles took a deep breath, his voice gentle but tinged with sadness. Your mother, James, she was one of my students. Her name was Anna. She was an incredibly gifted musician, someone who played not just with skill, but with a depth of emotion that touched everyone who heard her. James's heart raced as he listened, a sense of recognition stirring within him. Anna, he whispered, the name feeling both familiar and strange. Charles continued, his gaze distant as he spoke of the past. She had a fiery spirit, a passion for life and for music that was unmatched. I was her teacher, but more than that, I was her friend. We spent countless hours discussing music, philosophy, dreams for the future. She was like family to me. James leaned forward, hanging on every word. And my father? He asked, his voice filled with longing. Charles's expression softened. Your father, Michael, was a painter, an artist in every sense of the word. He had a gentle soul, a quiet strength that balanced your mother's passion. They met at a concert, fell in love, and eventually got married. Their love for each other was beautiful, something rare and profound. A warmth filled James's heart as he listened, a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt before. What happened to them? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles's face grew solemn, a flicker of pain crossing his features. They were in a car accident, James. It was sudden, tragic. You and Sophie survived, but you were too young to understand what had happened. James's chest tightened as he processed the weight of Charles's words. He remembered fragments, flashes of light, the feeling of being alone, the emptiness that had followed. He had buried those memories, unable to face them, but now they resurfaced, bringing a bittersweet clarity. After the accident, I tried to find you, but you had already been taken to the orphanage, Charles continued, his voice filled with regret. It wasn't until I saw you playing at the market that I realized who you were. That's when I knew I had to bring you home. James looked up at Charles, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Charles, for everything. Charles reached across, placing a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. Your family, James. You always have been. Emily, who had been listening quietly, placed a comforting hand on James's arm. You have us now, she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. We're here for you, no matter what. James managed a small smile, his heart filled with a newfound sense of peace. For so long, he had felt like a piece of his life was missing, a part of himself he could never fully understand. But now, with Charles and Emily by his side, he felt whole, connected to a past he could finally embrace. That evening, as James sat alone in his room, he took out his violin, feeling a deep need to express everything he had learned, everything he felt. He began to play, the notes soft and haunting, a melody that spoke of love, loss, and the journey that had brought him to this moment. The music filled the room, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace, a reminder that he was no longer alone. He had a family, a place where he belonged, and a history that he could honor through his music. As he played, a sense of calm settled over him, and he knew that, no matter what lay ahead, he was ready to face it. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains of his room, James found himself alone with his thoughts, the weight of the day's revelations still lingering in the air. He reached for his violin, feeling an overwhelming surge of emotions. The joy of newfound family, the pain of loss, and the bittersweet beauty of his journey thus far. With trembling hands, he opened the case, revealing the polished wood of the instrument that had been both his anchor and his voice in a world that had often felt chaotic and overwhelming. As he raised the violin to his shoulder, the cool touch of the wood sent a shiver down his spine. He closed his eyes, taking a moment to breathe deeply, allowing the memories to wash over him, images of his parents, their laughter, their love for music, and the dreams they had shared. The notes he began to play were soft at first, tentative, like the first light of dawn breaking through the darkness of night. Each stroke of the bow was a brush with his past, each note a step toward healing the wounds that had shaped him. The melody unfolded, flowing like a gentle river, weaving through the air with an ethereal grace. It was a haunting composition that spoke of love and loss, of the deep connections that bind family together, even across the boundaries of life and death. As the music swelled, it enveloped him like a warm embrace, a reminder that he was no longer alone in the world. He had found his way back to the heart of his family, to a home filled with laughter, love, and music. With every rise and fall of the melody, James felt his spirit lift, a sense of calm settling over him like a soft blanket on a chilly night. The worries of the past began to fade, replaced by a newfound strength. He played with passion, pouring his heart into each note, expressing the gratitude he felt for the people in his life, Charles, Emily, and Sophie, who had shown him that home is not just a place, but a feeling of belonging and acceptance. As the final notes lingered in the air, James opened his eyes, his heart racing with the thrill of the performance. The room felt alive, filled with an energy that was both soothing and invigorating. He knew in that moment that he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The shadows of his past no longer held power over him. Instead, they had become part of a larger tapestry, one that intertwined with the stories of his family, their hopes, their struggles, and their triumphs. For the first time in his life, James felt truly free. The weight of uncertainty lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and clarity. He had found his voice, not just as a musician, but as a young man who had navigated the complexities of loss and love, and emerged on the other side stronger than before. As he set his violin down, a smile broke across his face, radiant and hopeful. He knew that the journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. With a heart full of music and a spirit buoyed by love, James was ready to embrace the future, to create new memories, and to honor his past through every note he played. He stepped to the window, looking out at the starlit sky, feeling a sense of connection to something greater than himself. He had found his way home, not just to a place, but to the music that lived within him and the family that would forever be his guiding light.